Hubris syndrome, definition, symptom. What to do against these personalities. Russian President Vladimir Putin may have hubris syndrome, according to doctors who have observed him since he went to war with Ukraine. Definition, typical symptoms, treatment, all about this disease of power. Is he mad? The question is on everyone's lips as people watch, dumbfounded, Russian President Vladimir Putin's war in Ukraine since the end of February 2022. Many rumors are circulating about his state of health, cancer, Parkinson's disease. None has not been confirmed. Lately, doctors who have observed him have raised the possibility of hubris syndrome. Narcissism, arrogance, lying and manipulation are among its characteristics. This syndrome can affect anyone, at any age. Whether it's an abusive husband, a boss-militarist head of state, they are extremely dangerous personalities for others and of immense fragility, explains Dr. Bertrand Gilot, psychiatrist. Discovery. Definition. What is hubris syndrome? Hubris syndrome is a personality disorder, not a mental illness. Hubris or hybris in ancient Greek meant excess and in English pride. This syndrome is inextricably linked to power, it is a prerequisite. When power passes, the syndrome lessens. A hubristic personality is particularly common among heads of government. In psychoanalysis, we speak of hubris syndrome when a person shows narcissism, arrogance, pretentiousness, egotism, even manipulation, lies and contempt in reaction to his power. This person has the feeling of being invulnerable and having omnipotence. The person exceeds the limits of the admissible in the perception of himself and in the relationship to others. There is a overvaluation of self and permanent undervaluation of others. In the notion of hubris, in Greek mythology, there is also always the notion of violence. It is an archaic return to raw violence, to a uniquely destructive power that goes beyond what humans should be content with, explains to USDR. Bertrand Gilot, psychiatrist. What are the symptoms of hubris syndrome? Several behavioral symptoms are associated with hubris syndrome. According to the doctor and former English minister David Owen, you must have at least 3 or 4 of the following list to be considered to have this syndrome. Narcissistic propensity to see the world as an arena in which to exercise power and seek glory. Predisposition to engage in actions likely to present themselves in a favorable light, i.e. to embellish one's image. Disproportionate appeal for image and appearance. Messianic way of talking about what one does with a tendency to exaltation in speech and manners. Identification of oneself with the nation insofar as the perspectives and interests of the two are identical. Tendency to talk about oneself in the third person or to use we. Excessive reliance on one's own judgment and disregard for the advice or criticism of others. Exaggerated self-confidence, bordering on a feeling of omnipotence, in what they can personally achieve. Conviction that instead of being responsible to public opinion, the only tribunal to which he will have to answer will be that of history, often accompanied by an unshakable conviction that in this tribunal they will be vindicated. Restlessness, recklessness and impulsiveness. Loss of touch with reality, often associated with progressive isolation. Tendency to give importance to one's vision, to one's choice, which avoids considering the practical aspects or evaluating the costs and undesirable consequences. Incompetence. When things go wrong because excessive self-confidence has led the leader to neglect the usual workings of politics, of law. Symptoms usually subside when the person no longer exerts power. It is less likely to develop in modest people, open to criticism, who have a certain cynicism or a well-developed sense of humor. We often have to do with great paranoids or great perverts. What are the characteristics of a person with hubris syndrome? If we link this syndrome to what we observe in humans who have had a lot of power and who have exercised it in a tyrannical way, we often have to do with great paranoids or great perverts, continues the psychiatrist. The paranoiac, more often a man, is the one we hear about in the news items, the man convinced that his neighbor is doing things on purpose to harm him, who goes to tell everyone about it, and who, seeing that no one doesn't take him seriously, ends up killing his neighbor and committing suicide behind. He never questions himself. These are people who reason in a fair, structured way but whose reasoning is based on a starting postulate which is false. We see the same logic in tyrants. Hitler, Stalin. These are people intimately convinced of being right from the start and who will put all their power at the service of this certainty of being right. Anyone who will oppose, challenge or even just question this certainty will be placed among their enemies. The characteristics of the pervert are sometimes added. The pervert does not consider the other as the other. The other only exists as a tool or object that we will be able to use or damage if we want to. The other is perceived as an extension of ourselves with which we can do what we want. He is not perceived as a being in his own right. Whether it is a violent husband, a megalomaniac business leader or a militaristic head of state, they are extremely dangerous personalities for others and of immense fragility, continues Dr. Gilot. The person with a hubristic profile leaves no room for failure, doubt, nuance. Everything is extremely brutal, and in the event of confrontation with their failure it is generally suicide, violent suicide, which occurs. Possibly by sowing destruction around them before committing suicide. This position of omnipotence is there to defend oneself from a reality which is powerlessness. Who are the personalities affected by hubris syndrome? Hubris syndrome is particularly common among government leaders, but it can affect any other person in private life, at work, and manifest at any age. In his book In Sickness and in Power, the English Dr. David Owen considers that the following 4 heads of government have developed this syndrome of pride: Lloyd George, Margaret Thatcher, George W. Bush and Tony Blair. In March 2022, doctors who observed the attitude of Russian President Vladimir Putin, at war with Ukraine, believe that he has it. Are there treatments for hubris syndrome? There is no medicinal treatment to cure hubris syndrome. According to Dr. David Owen, the symptoms generally subside when the person no longer exerts power. She would also have to be surrounded by critics to counter her feeling of absolute omnipotence. But still it is necessary that this person hears these criticisms and that it manages to modify its reasoning, which is rarely the case. Silence is always more dangerous than speech. What to do with a person with hubris syndrome? You have to get away from it to protect yourself from it, answers Dr. Bertrand Gilot straight away. At work, the best thing is to quit your job. In the couple that has become toxic, it's the same thing, you have to separate from this person. Each time you try to reason with the other, you will have lost anyway, because it is not played out in the dialogue or just the time to imagine other solutions. In a geopolitical conflict with a person assured of his omnipotence and the validity of his actions, as we observe with the Russian president at war against Ukraine, it is difficult to imagine a calm outcome, explains our interlocutor. We are only in the balance of power with total contempt for the other where we are certain to be victorious. There is an illusory race, an endless headlong rush. If the Russian president anesses Europe, he will need Africa, then Asia. However, the more he is victorious, the more his potential for dangerousness increases. So what to do? Do not react and let him do it? It's dangerous because the omnipotence is increased. The more success he obtains, the more power and therefore danger he takes. We saw with Hitler what happened. There is a psychic need to reinforce oneself. The demonstration of force towards others aims above all to reassure oneself. Behind this great danger, there is an immense internal fragility. We are no longer in a rational logic. Resist? To oppose? If we resist, he will get angry. If we oppose him and defeat him, he will face a collapse of his certainties, and he can also be extremely violent. Dialogue? Dialogue does not always help much, but not to dialogue is worse. Silence is always more dangerous than speech. It is always true even in the face of this kind of personality. We can hope that dialogue instills a little doubt, a tiny bit of nuance. You shouldn't hope that the person will come to his senses, but that he will round off certain angles a little bit. Put him face to face with his failures so that he goes from omnipotence to impotence? Being faced with a failure impossible to deny destabilizes, but we do not know what real information he has to assess this failure. We cannot know in advance the tipping point between the two.